and they ultimately learn how they themselves can make a difference in our government. The Kennedy Institute is dedicated to encouraging just that type of civic engagement and civic participation, with the hopes of inspiring the next generation of citizens and leaders to become more involved in their own communities. And in addition to that, we've recently, as some of you have noticed, expanded our programming to include encouragement of bipartisanship and strengthening our democracy in this country. And we do that through a range of new programs, often by linking elbows with the institutes of former Republican senators. And we also do that through our public events, which you're all participating in tonight. And so we are really privileged to have two national leaders who can reflect using their influential voices on what we're seeing right now after the election and as we turn to the next session of the U.S. Senate. So thank you both for being here. Steve Scully, who I'll be handing it over to now, is our moderator. He's the host of Sirius XM's The Briefing. He serves as a senior fellow at the Former Members of Congress Association, a senior strategic advisor to the Bipartisan Policy Center. And if you're like me, you recognize him from C-SPAN, where he was a senior executive producer and political editor for 3 decades. Selfishly, I think his most impressive credential on his resume is that he was once a staffer for Senator Ted Kennedy. Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adam. And senators, welcome to Boston. Welcome to the EMK Institute. Do you feel at home?
Well, when I walked in earlier, before we all got here, I had a chance to come in and just look around, and it's stunningly like the Senate. And I went over and stood behind my desk right there in the middle of the second row, where I was sitting by Lindsey Graham on one side and Senator Cornyn on the other. But every senator most senators move every 2 years, and everything's done by seniority. And if you're the 100th senator, you get to sit in the desk that's left when everybody else has a desk. But it's a great accomplishment and a great way to have a sense of what the Senate's like and what happens there.
Senator Heitkamp?
Well, the interesting thing is I was the 100th senator. So whatever was left, which was way back in that corner over there, but the 99th, I think at the time, was Mazie Hirono. We were elected at the same time, and we became fast friends, and she was my ohana, which means family in Hawaiian, and we decided we would never part. We would always sit next to each other. So it limited options when we were looking at moving, but sat over there. In fact, I think Elizabeth Warren sat behind us. Kamala Harris sat behind us. So the back bench was actually better than the middle seats. So I had the little kid's seat.
So why was she 99 and you were 100?
Because North Dakota is a smaller state than Hawaii. And so it goes first by seniority, and you get ranked, which I'm bitter about because I'm a former attorney general, but if you were governor, you got extra points in seniority when you looked at how seniority rankings went. And so when you're a former attorney general, tax commissioner from a state that is one of the smallest states in the union, you get to be 100th. And so I have a license plate that says 100, and there's some bragging rights to that.
There's some bragging rights to that, and if you're a House member, you get to count. That counts as well. But if you're a former senator, so when I came to the Senate, Dan Coates was coming back to the Senate, and so he outranked all of us since he was a former senator. And then Jerry Moran and I from Kansas had gone to the House together, so we had the same amount of service. And Jerry had to draw out of an envelope, and he drew the wrong number, so I was always senior to Jerry, and all the time we were in the Senate together, but he's still there, so he's senior to me now.
And we were in earlier, and of course the most important desk is right over there, correct?
The candy desk. The candy desk, and started by, you had a candy desk on your side as well?
Absolutely.
I was never allowed to get close to that desk, I guess.
Well, welcome.
You could have come over anytime.
And I did.
We'll talk about the election in a moment, but Senator Blunt, I want to begin with you because, as you know, the role of the Senate is advise and consent. we are now in the middle of some pretty fierce confirmation debates. You have a new Senate Republican leader, somebody who you worked with, John Thune. So how does he navigate a Trump presidency 2.0, some nominees that are going to be contentious, and ensuring that the Senate does its duty to advise and consent?
Well, I do think the consent part is an important part of that, and sometimes just give advice, and the advice normally turns out to be, we really don't think this person is up to the job. But that doesn't happen very often. Usually that person doesn't get to the Senate floor for whatever reason. Something comes up, their name's withdrawn. Seldom does that happen. My rule normally, Steve, and I think this will be the rule for most Republicans, if not most people in the Senate, my rule was that a president gets a lot of leeway here. And if it's somebody that's coming in and leaving when the president leaves, I tried my best to be for that person, whether it was a Democrat president or a Republican. If it was somebody that coming in for life, like a judge, or for a 10-year term on a commission or something, I looked at them in a different way than I did the people that were going to be literally there only when the president was there. And I think generally the people that I would have opposed never actually made it to, they either didn't get out of the committee to come to the floor, or they often, somebody like that winds up withdrawing their name or being asked to withdraw their name by the president, or he withdraws their name before you ever have a chance to make that vote. I think the Senate wants the committees to look at the nominees closely. I think they will do that. There's a process that goes on where you're looked at by usually the FBI. There's a little controversy on that right now, but I think the Senate will look at these members and look at these nominees, and all of them, for various reasons, will not be nominated. But normally, I think the president does get a lot of leeway here, who he wants to be part of his administration.
But Senator Heitkamp, the other part of this debate, the possibility of recess appointments, we saw that immediately after the election. It could come to the forefront when the new Congress takes office in January. What are your concerns?
Well, I mean, I think when you look at kind of the nomination process, I'm with Roy. They have to give me a reason, a really, really strong reason, to oppose a nominee for a cabinet position in particular. The president got elected, he's entitled to his team. That doesn't mean that there aren't disqualifying factors. And so I think that a lot of the recessed appointment talk went away with Gates. I think there was enough pushback from members of the Republican Party that it was questionable. Even if John Thune had tried to take it to recess, he needed a majority of his party to recess the Senate, and I'm not sure he would have gotten that. And so I think that that has been a calibrating moment. You don't hear the president-elect, former President Trump, talking right now about recessed appointments, but you do see a push to shorten the kind of scrutiny that may ordinarily come. Now, you might think that an FBI background check is somehow magically in the books, that this has to be done. That's, again, a norm that we've had for a lot of years that looks like now may go by the wayside. Question is whether the committee chairs or whether the minority will ask for kind of background checks. Obviously, the FBI will not be an agency during that time period. That will be controlled by Chris Wray. Likely that will even if he doesn't get a confirmation of his FBI person, he could in fact terminate the tenure of Christopher Wray. And so I think that there's a lot of what ifs, and this is a big job for John Thune, which is trying to figure out how he is going to support his president, which quite honestly, every senator or leader in a majority party that has a president in your party, they have to consider supporting their president. But you also have to consider the prerogatives of Article 1, advise and consent. And what does it mean if you simply rubber stamp and don't go through the process these nominees. And I think the one thing that Roy may disagree with me on is this is a process that if you approve someone who later on something comes out about them that you didn't know, that has peril for the senator that voted for confirmation. Now with that, I would tell you I voted for every one of Trump's original cabinet members, most of which we knew, you know, whether it was Jeff Sessions or whether it was Rex Tillerson, who I knew from his work in the oil and gas industry. The only one I didn't vote for was Betsy DeVos. I didn't think she had the background, and I think education is so critical. But so she still got confirmed. I think all of his nominees got confirmed. I don't think they withdrew anyone in that first go-around, and we've already seen one withdrawal.
So let me go back to the earlier question. What advice do you give John Thune? Because he has a really delicate balancing act of being loyal to Donald Trump, but also I would say he is somebody who really adheres to the institution and wants to preserve the role of the Senate.
Well, I think that's the advice. You need to preserve the role of the Senate. And there's a reason the Senate is the Congress is Article 1 in the Constitution. And you need to honor that preeminence that the Constitution gives the Congress. We've lost a lot of that in the last 50 years, but there's more and more interest, I think, in restoring the job of the Congress to the Congress, but the Congress has to be willing to do its job. But I would just say the explanation here was really pretty good. You have an obligation to the Senate, but you also have an obligation to the president of your party if you're the majority leader and the president is of your party.
So because we are here in this replica of the Senate, which is magnificent and beautiful and really a testament to the U.S. Senate, I want to get into some of the policy areas and the procedures, including regular order. And this is something that you, Senator Heitkamp, have been very fervent on, returning to the committee process, returning to regular order, not letting 2 or 4 House and Senate leaders dictate the budget, which has happened. Congress has not passed a budget on time since 1996, when Bill Clinton was in the White House and Newt Gingrich was Speaker. How do we get back to regular order?
Let me tell you, that is one of the primary reasons why the favorabilities of the United States Congress are in maybe double digits, maybe. And our friend John McCain say, why so high? Why so high? You know, the bottom line is, and I'll just tell it from my perspective, when I got to the United States Senate, I assumed I would be voting. You would assume I'd be voting. America assumes the Senate votes. And yet, I mean, Harry Reid was the majority leader, and we weren't voting on anything, literally. I mean, and it was finally, Claire McCaskill called it the Heidi insurrection. Finally, I just said, I came to vote. I came to do stuff. I didn't come to just sit in a chair and have people, you know, whatever, glorify this job, sitting in this chair down here if we're not legislating, if we're not debating, if we're not talking about the issues of the day, which honestly, everybody criticizes C-SPAN because they say, oh, it's when the cameras came in, things didn't get done. I don't think that's true. I think when the cameras came in, that's when Congress, or when the institution plummeted in terms of favorability, not because they were doing too much, because all they saw was an empty chamber. All they saw was nothing, you know, quorum calls. And so I went to Harry and I said, you know, can we just vote? And he goes, you know, Heidi, there's a lot of issues people don't want to take a vote on. And I said, you know what, Harry? I am the most vulnerable Democrat in this entire chamber, and if I say I'll vote, then everybody should be willing to vote, right? And so one of the problems, I think, when you look at leadership in the Senate is that they do 2 things. Number one, actually 3, myopically focus on protecting the executive if the executive is of their political party. Number 2, protecting their majority at the risk of not getting anything done, because anytime you get things done, guess what? You got 51% of the people happy and 49% unhappy. And I think the last thing, and I think the most important part of this is, there was a time when the leaders of the Senate led the Senate. They were not political leaders. They represented the institution that got things done. And I think Ted Kennedy comes from that tradition. Somebody who said, fine, I didn't get to be president, guess what? I'm going to take maximum advantage to get things done in the United States Senate. John McCain on the other side didn't get to be president. Maximum advantage of getting things done. And when the leadership is myopically focused on protecting their majority as opposed to getting things done, nothing gets done. And so, and the public is not served, and Article 1 perishes, withers on the vine, because executive authority will move right into that void, and understandably so.
And Senator Blunt, speaking of nothing getting done, as you well know, because you served in the House and in the Senate, the biggest divide in Washington is often not between the White House and the president, between Democrats and Republicans. It is between the House and the Senate. How do you fix that?
Well, I think you fix it in a lot by just letting people be part of the system. You know, the whole idea of regular order is what you learn in the civics class about how the Congress is supposed to work. You have committees that know more about the topic of their committee, hopefully, than anybody else in the Congress does. They pass a bill. They try to amend the bill. They have a vigorous debate on the bill. They have a chance to take that bill to the floor and defend it again to the other members. The House does the same thing. You have a conference committee. You know, I was in the House for 14 years and the Senate for 12. So in the 26 years I was there, really, even the first couple of years in the Senate still functioned largely like it had in the past. And then the leaders, frankly, in my view, took over. And I've said this publicly. I've said it to every one of them. I've said it to many press conferences, that if you don't let the members be part of the work, then they don't honor the work, they honor the fight. And too many people now run for the fight rather than the job. You know, because, well, frankly, when they get there, all they get to do is be part of the fight. For a long time, for 220 or so years, the principal job of the Congress was to set the priorities of the country by determining how we spend our money. It's how you set your priority at home. It's how you set your priority in the government. And, you know, we would take those 12 appropriations bills, all of them to the floor, occasionally one a couple at a time. But the labor, health, and education bill's the biggest besides defense. It's the most controversial. And we would spend 2 and sometimes 3 weeks on the House floor, when I was the whip of the House, debating that one bill. And the rule at the time was any member could bring any amendment they wanted to, as long as they paid for it by taking the money from something else in that bill, or not spending, just taking the money away. And by the time you got a couple of weeks into that bill, 1, people understood it. 2, they had more appreciation for how hard it was to bring that to the floor. And 3, they had a chance to do whatever they wanted to do and find out how many people agree with you. And, you know, you got 100 senators, or you've got 435 House members, and only 10 of them agree with you. You got to think, well, maybe that wasn't such a good amendment after all. I see why it didn't get out of the committee, because nobody was willing to agree that that was what we ought to do. And so buying into the process, honoring the committee work, giving the members something to do that is part of what they're supposed to do, would benefit the House, the Senate, and the country in a significant way. And the leaders need to figure that out. Too many times now, the 2 Senate leaders, the 2 House leaders, and about a dozen staffers get in this star chamber and come up with one big bill that never gets debated, that nobody knows what's in it till it's passed. But it is essential to fund the government. So if you're a member who wasn't part of that, you know, barely a majority usually pass that bill, and that's what it takes to keep the government functioning.
Senator Heitkamp, the filibuster is not in the Constitution. It dates back to, 1806, and we've come a long way from, Jimmy Stewart, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, or Strom Thurmond in the marathon, 25-hour debate that he had in the filibuster in the 1950s. Some have said it's a relic of the past. Others say it protects the minority. Should it stay? Should it be nixed? What is your view?
Well, I made my view pretty well known when I signed a letter after, I forget, it was maybe after Harry changed the rules on court nominations, then we signed a letter saying on substantive bills we were not going to change the filibuster. That quickly, a lot of people who signed that letter, they didn't stay with that position. So I am a big believer that on final passage in particular, a 60-vote majority is, it hasn't been necessary across history. And the filibuster now is a weapon, has been weaponized by a lot of people to try and have their say or to try and stop things. That shouldn't happen. That's a norm that has been violated. But at the end of the day, when you pass a bill with 60 votes, it has a lot more staying power. And one of the things that you're going to see, I think, especially since we've been governing by executive order, whether it is on healthcare premium issues or whether it's on student loan forgiveness, whatever it might be, because those things haven't made their way through. There's no permanency to them. And so a 60-vote majority on really important bills like reforming Dodd-Frank, which is one that we did when I was there, those give it a gravitas that they wouldn't otherwise have and a permanency that they wouldn't otherwise have. And I think they're better bills. And so I know it's frustrating to the public, but what you ought to be concerned about is people who have weaponized the filibuster, who filibuster everything. And the reaction from leadership, again, because they have more control. If that bill doesn't come to the floor, they can always do the backroom deal. I mean, they don't have any real need to burn up the clock to do any of this legislation. So there's never any push because you can filibuster a motion to proceed and never even hear about the bill again. And that shouldn't happen. So we should be able to do filibuster reform that gives the American public the idea of what is being debated, what's being talked about. But on final passage, I would not change the filibuster.
Senators, and you were on the Senate floor when Harry Reid invoked the nuclear option when it came to judicial nominees. He basically said, look, your party was blocking everything. He needed to do something to move this Senate through. Was that a mistake?
Of course, it was a mistake, and what he really wanted to do was pack the D.C. Circuit Court. There were no Supreme Court vacancies. That court had a lot of vacancies. Harry wanted to fill them, and he wanted to fill them with 51 votes instead of 60. On the filibuster generally, I chaired the Rules Committee a majority of the time I was in the Senate. I think about 6 of the 12 years, maybe 8. And I'd proposed some changes where we would get to the bill easier, debate the bill with 51 votes, but I agree totally with Heidi on the importance of 60 votes is you do wind up with legislation that is more in the middle. There have never been 60 popularly elected Republicans. I think 56 is the highest number ever. There have only been 60 Democrats a handful of times, and that goes all the way back to the Great Depression when we had those big numbers of Democrats for a long time. But if you have to get 60 people, that almost always means you have to have at least somebody on the other side on your side. And it just changes the character of the debate. If somebody on the other side is for a bill, it makes it hard for the entire opposite side to attack everybody who voted for the bill, for instance. And it creates a great permanency in the House that passes a lot of things with a majority that never become law. The next Congress comes in and they pass the opposite bills. And that's what would happen to the law itself if you didn't have the safeguard of the Senate of almost insisting that there be some element of bipartisan cooperation before you have a bill that goes to the president's desk, and that's a good thing.
So let's talk about the character of Supreme Court nominees, and certainly Ted Kennedy was front and center with the Robert Bork confirmation, which was very contentious, that led to Justice Scalia, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan. As you both know, when he passed away, a 10, almost 11-month period between his death and a nomination that was held up by your Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, and then, of course, 4 years later, a very different situation because Amy Coney Barrett was fast forward through, what, 4, 5, 6 weeks. And Mitch McConnell has said, look, Democrats would have done the same thing. But just looking at it in terms of the institution, let me begin with you, Senator Blunt. Your thoughts on how that impacted the politics of the Senate and the Supreme Court?
Well, in the end of the first 2 years of the Bush administration, I think once you get to year 3, Democrats are in control of the Senate. Senator Schumer was not the majority leader, but he led this particular fight, and he announced there's not a Supreme Court vacancy yet, but if there is, I'm just telling you, we're not going to fill it until after this presidential election. So there's no question that both sides would look at those late things that way if they're in the majority. If you're in the majority and there's an opportunity to fill a vacancy, they would both try to do that as well. You could argue that changing the rules to where 51 could do that clearly made a difference. But once those rules get changed, they don't get changed back, which was why on that, you know, when Senator Reid changed the rules to 51, Senator McConnell at the time said, you'll be sorry you did this, and you may be sorry sooner than you think. And within 18 months, Republicans were in the majority, and they had the tool that had been used against them now that they could use on their own, and they did.
But what about the delay with the Merrick Garland appointment and the lightning speed of Amy Coney Barrett?
That's what either majority would do. If you didn't do that and you were in the majority, you essentially would have failed to do what you're expected to do if you're in the majority.
I think if anyone thought that in November, or let's say October, there was a death in the Supreme Court, that there wouldn't have been a nomination pushed through the Democratic Senate, you're not living the political reality. I think the real challenge here and the real shame of all of this change, even for the down ballot, which I voted for, when you're giving a lifetime appointment to someone, there should be more scrutiny than a 4-year political appointment. And I would tell you that to fix this problem, you need to get rid of lifetime appointments of judges.
Including the Supreme Court.
I totally agree. I think they should be term limited. Because I think that no, I do. I mean, and I've checked the constitutionality. That's a dubious constitutional. But I would want to advance the argument. And I will tell you this, because once you give someone a lifetime appointment, what's been happening, the nominees are younger and younger and younger. And you end up with judges that don't know much, that maybe not even tried a case, and now they're sitting on the federal bench because they fill a political slot. And so to me, rather than worrying about the appointment stuff, because you can't have a system where the Senate is controlled by one party and the president by another, and you don't appoint any judges. I mean, that's where we're headed. And I think if you if there wasn't permanency to the decision, I think that there would be the appointment process would be easier. And I will tell you, this is a personal story. I got a lot of criticism back home for not voting for Justice Kavanaugh. And when people ask me, well, you voted for a lot of political appointees that you didn't agree with, I said, but none of them had a lifetime appointment. I wasn't making that decision for today. I wasn't even making it for 4 years from now. I was making it for 30, 40 years. And to me, you know, that person has to be above reproach in order for me to give the good housekeeping seal of approval.
And of course, we could be going through this next year. Pretty good chance that Donald Trump will have one, perhaps two more Supreme Court nominees in his term in the White House. What about the idea of having term limits or age limits for Supreme Court justices?
Well, you know, age varies from person to person. I don't think I'm for either term limits or age limits. The Constitution tried to remove the judges from the political pressure of terms or election, either one, and I think that's served us pretty well.
I think if you said 20 years and out, that's plenty. You know, you've had your time on the bench, and this is the other thing about the Supreme Court, and I will say this, and it's always bothered me. There are no ethical responsibility. They set their own ethics, and I think you have to have a sense of taking a look at what's happened, taking a look at the kind of latitude that Supreme Court justices have who are deciding cases compared to what a senator can do under ethics is like day and night.
But the Chief Justice would say, look, three separate but equal branches of government, and we will monitor our judges, and you do the Senate.
They should do a better job monitoring their judges. Yeah, I mean, that's the point. That when an institution fails to respond to legitimate concerns about ethical issues, then all of a sudden people look for workarounds. And so what I would say is, that's fine, then do your job and make sure that people, when they stand in front of that court, believe that they come and justice is blind, that they have equal opportunity to present their case. And when somebody is on a junket with you know, a corporation or with an individual that may have a personal stake in that case, there isn't any state court that would allow that I know of. Certainly wouldn't be allowed in the state of North Dakota.
Let's talk about the election. Kamala Harris, what happened?
Oh, me? She didn't get enough votes.
But the popular vote was a lot tighter than people expected.
Oh, you know, I think, you know, I think those of us who are Democrats were delusional. We thought she could win with a 70-30 wrong track, right track number for the country, right? And the only reason we thought that is we thought Donald Trump was so horrendous as a choice that, of course, you know, she could go in with a record that people didn't believe reflected their opportunity needs, their economic needs, and she could overcome it. She also didn't have a lot of time. Let's just admit that. And I think, you know, I think that we could go woulda, shoulda, coulda. I think the more important thing for me to say is two things here. Number one, I'm glad it was bigger than what we expected. Because when they're this close, there is always that, you know, kind of rancor, and you don't see it this time because people say, okay, the country voted, it's clear that they maybe wanted a different direction. And those of us who are Democrats can say, look, we lost. And so how do we recalibrate? How do we re-message? How do we govern differently to get a majority back of the American people? And I think those are really two important general political responses that you should always have in this spot. And you know, the one thing I will say is this idea that you just carpet bomb everything that Trump wants to do or that the administration wants to do, because that might look good on C-SPAN or it might look good to constituencies, that is the wrong strategy. There may be some things that he wants to do that we agree with, and we should say we agree with that. The American public wants to see people who are willing to listen, people who are willing to govern together, and then fight when it's important, not fight everything. And so, to me, you know, when the country thinks, 70% of the country thinks you're on the wrong track, and you represent that administration, you coming as close as what she did is pretty remarkable, quite honestly.
Senator Blunt, obviously you're a Republican, but just looking at it as somebody who understands politics and the process, you can't go back in time. But had Joe Biden dropped out perhaps this time last year or even earlier, announcing that he would not run, and allowing a primary process for the Democrats to kind of go through that process, that system, to select a nominee. Perhaps it would have still been Kamala Harris. If that had happened, I realize it's a big if, would that have changed anything?
I think it would have changed a lot. And I think that's what President Biden should have done. I think it's what everybody expected him to do in 2020, that he would be a bridge to the next generation of leadership. And I think he made an unfortunate decision for his own legacy and for himself. I've known him a long time. I like him. He's the guy who wants to like you, and he wants you to like him, and it works most of the time. But there was a case, where 80 is not the same for everybody. I think it was an unfortunate end to his own incredible career of service, that he leaves with this sense of somebody who wasn't up to the job. And if he had announced 2 years ago, I could give the speech. As many of you had expected and I had hoped for, I ran to get the country back in what I thought was a better place, and I won't be running again. Then you'd have had an open primary process. Unlikely that it would have been the vice president, possible, but there's a reason we don't elect vice presidents. One, they're seen as secondary figures. Two, they have almost all of the negatives of the president that they're serving with and none of the positives. And so with the exception of George H.W. Bush in 1988, the last time we elected a vice president was Martin Van Buren in 1836.
Joe Biden was vice president, but he took
a
4 years off.
a setting vice president. I mean, Richard Nixon was vice president too. But we have not had a history of this for a reason. And if she had been the nominee, she would have had much more time to think about how you really express your position on issues different from the president you're serving with. Clearly, the issues were in President Trump's favor. The border, the economy, public safety. And he spent not much time talking about the issues. He spent time talking about lots of different things. But the issues were to his advantage, and I think the vice president was never able to really frame those issues in the way she'd like to. I served with her for 2 years on the Intel committee, and I like her. I think she's a talented and smart person, but faced a huge obstacle that at the end of the day was insurmountable.
You also served with her. Was she able to define herself, who she was? Because even as 4 years as vice president, most Americans did not know the Kamala Harris story.
Yeah, I mean, I've known Kamala since she was the Attorney General of California. I'm a former Attorney General. We used to all get together, and she's incredibly smart and very, very talented. And it's kind of like the majority leader, right? Your job as vice president isn't to go and openly criticize what you don't agree with the president. It's to be the loyal, spokesperson to get out there and promote the message. And so, when you represent an administration that the country thinks is not doing a good job, is leading the country in the wrong direction, that's a big lift, even if you can define yourself. I have Republican friends who say that the short time span worked in her favor. Who knows? I believe in competition. Okay, this is going to sound mean. If you're a Democrat from a state like North Dakota, you've been in a few political fights. You've had some tough elections. You've had to walk into a room of people who really don't like you much and at least get a couple of them nodding their heads that they agree with you. And so you have a certain level of political skill that you may not have coming from a deep blue state. If you're running in a primary, your argument is usually you're further to the right or further to the left of your opponent. And so all of that drives your positions that far over. She was in that spot when she ran for president in 2020. And so it was hard to recover from some of the things that were said. So the favorabilities of people who knew her were not high. In fact, she was able, unlike your question, she was able to build her resume. She was able to talk about, but she didn't. There
wasn't a narrative to her life
right.
story.
Well, that's right. But you know, at the end of the day, the obligatory position she had to defend the administration and defend the sitting president did not serve her well. And that's why we're saying that the Democrats may have gone with somebody who could distance themselves from that administration, saying, yeah, Joe did a good job, but I would have done this differently, I would have handled this differently, and had a lot more credibility.
Like maybe a senator from North Dakota?
No, not her. She's done.
I'm going to summarize. There's a number of questions related to the debt and the deficit. As you know, next year, raising the debt limit is going to be priority one, dealing with the Trump tax cuts. And oh, by the way, a $36 trillion national debt. Do both parties finally come together and say, we're going to work to solve the problem? Republicans have the House, the Senate, the White House, so you have the Trioca. Will it happen?
Well, we've shown very little interest about the national debt. There's no question. And you take the big spending programs off the table in every political campaign as it starts. You have to look at Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the structure of all of those, if you hope to balance the budget and do something about it. The debt is ridiculous right now. It's going to catch up with us and has already. We spent more on interest on the debt in this last year than we did to defend the country, which is the single biggest discretionary priority, is defending the country. It's, I think, the number one priority of the federal government. More importantly, just in spending, it's about half of all the discretionary spending, and we spent more on debt, servicing the debt, than we did on that. But something has to be done about it, but you have to have leadership who's willing to say, we're going to deal with these big issues if you're going to do something about the debt.
I wrote an op-ed, and the title was, if you want to fix the debt, make it political. Everybody, when I'm in North Dakota, people say, oh, there's debt and deficit. And then they vote for people who will raise it, including me, right? And so we all have to look in the mirror. And the point is, until debt and deficit become a political, by that I mean a voting issue, until the voters really get upset about it, there's really no incentive for anyone to fix it, because you're going to get a lot more mileage out of handing out the goodies, right? You know, you need this, you need that. And I always pick on general aviation because it's amazing how much power they have. That's your little small airports and people who fly their own planes. They have a lot of money and they have a lot of clout. And so you could point out, and this is what I'm really interested in watching, this administration, to see how they deal with the so-called DOGE. Is that it?
DOGE, yes.
DOGE.
It's a department in name only, Department of Government Efficiency.
You know, let's see what they come up with, because it will at least start the conversation about how we need to be spending money. But there's no mystery to what needs to be done. And we have, I will say this, and Roy knows this better than I do because he's so many years been the healthcare expert. You look at the demographics of this country, and you look at the aging of this country, the single fastest growing problem that we have is medical costs. And how do you deal with the high cost of serving more and more post-65-year-old citizens in this country with quality health care that's affordable for the country? And this is going to, I mean, if you think it's bad now, and we got addicted to cheap money. America was addicted to cheap money. You know, when I was there, money was free. What did I mean by that? The interest rate was lower than inflation. To me, that's free money. But you know what? It's not free anymore, and it shouldn't be free. And so until it becomes a voting issue, debt and deficit won't be solved.
You know, you'd hope it wouldn't take a crisis, but the crisis that's clearly out there is the first major crisis. Could be that year in 32 or 34 when we no longer can honor the Social Security obligations. Now, it doesn't mean you wouldn't get your check, but it might mean you got 80% of your check. And suddenly this is a real issue to lots of people. And you'd hate to think that that's what it would take for us to get serious about the deficit and the debt issue, but it's not. It'll be here quicker than you think, and we should be ready for it.
And quicker if we don't tax Social Security, income tax, because all that money goes into the trust fund. And so it will shorten the time period to I think it's 2030, if we take away the income tax.
Or maybe raise the cap. Right now, 156,000 is.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a mathematical problem. You can solve Social Security. There's no mystery to how to do this. And in fact, when I did a stint at the Institute of Politics over at the University at Harvard, and we had a hackathon where we had a bunch of really smart kids put together a plan. We had these brilliant plans that students came up with because it's not that hard to solve. What's hard is finding the political will to solve it.
So we're going to get some questions from the audience. I'm going to give you my last question now so you can think about it. Senator Blunt, if you could give one piece of advice to the incoming president and or Senate Republican leaders, what would that be? And the question to you, your advice to Senate Democratic leaders. So that's for the end of the conversation, but let's get to questions from the audience. So we will turn to, where are the mics? Who has a question? Yes. Yep, if you raise your hand. Nobody has a question. We've answered all of them. They're right over here. Thank you so much. Now we'll have about 100 of them.
Yeah. So we were referring to the, are you referring to the population aging from Medicare and tanking out around age, or the year 2032? And I understand that the earning population was about 2 to 1 in seniors, and that around that time it'll be 1 to 1. So if we need to fill, fill that demographic, is immigration the answer to that? Because we have less and less young people, and how does that fit in?
Because as you know, this year, every day, about 10,000 new retirees take Social Security, 10,000 a day on average.
Well, and when Social Security started, and by the way, you're in my seat from the last 2 years I was in the Senate, so that hopefully nobody will hold that against you. When Social Security started, the age was 65, but there were 35 people working for every person drawing Social Security. So we've gone from 35 to 1 to 2 to 1, and just changing the age in the Reagan-O'Neill agreement on this by 2 years phased in over almost 15 or 16 years bought a whole decade of solvency, if not more than a decade of solvency. Demographics are pretty easy to figure out, and if you do what was done last time, plenty of time to plan. I'm going to have to be 67 in 2 months instead of 60, and I'm going to have to be 60. Your younger brother's going to have to be 67 in 6 months. There's plenty of ways out of this, but you can't take it off the table at the beginning of every election cycle, and both candidates say, one thing we're not going to do is anything about Social Security and Medicare, and hope you're going to solve this problem. You can eliminate all of the other discretionary spending and still not balance the budget.
So I think your question also is, and maybe I heard it wrong, but immigration. And you're absolutely right that you can't separate those two challenges. If in fact the president is successful, and there's a disagreement about whether he really means to do this, but if he deports every undocumented person working in this country, and most of them are working, that would take 13 million people out of the system, and figure out who's going to staff a nursing home, who's going to staff a restaurant. I mean, you could just go through who these workers are. But the important part is that the United States is late to this, but if you look at Japan and almost all of Europe, we have a crisis of replacement. By that I mean we are not having enough children to replace the population, which means that there are fewer young people supporting our senior citizens, and that bubble will continue as we go forward. And so the question is, how do you solve this problem with with a strategy that you're going to decrease the workforce and decrease the numbers. And one of the things that probably I get more irritated about than anything is they say, look, they're all taking government services and they're not paying in. Most of these people are paying into Social Security under false IDs, and that money's going into the fund. You take that money out of the fund, what's that do to the Social Security Trust Fund?
So, Senator, let me jump
That's
in.
made let me say this.
Yeah.
That's made a difference. And immigration generally, legal immigration's made a difference. Kept our demographics lower than they otherwise would have been. And we ought to look for, immigration is the future friend of the country, just like it was the past friend of the country. But we need to figure out how to do it on a legal basis that's probably very much tied to the legitimate workforce needs of the country, both high and low. And we can't accept the idea that you can't control your borders as a nation. It's one of the legitimate tests of whether you're really a country or not, whether you can control the borders of the country. And we can't continue to let people come in knowing that they are not qualified for asylum and give them a court date 6 years in advance and tell them to just do their best between now and the end of that 6 years. And you know, if they are working, they're paying into the system and having and they're certainly not drawing out of Social Security because they're working under false Social Security numbers.
So let me take, this is a question from Jack Farrell, but I'm going to frame it in terms of immigration. These are his words. To what extent will the Senate in 2025 act as a check or limit on the power of what he describes an increasingly imperial presidency? Let me take the immigration debate because Congress will need to fund this deportation program. Is that an area where you see the Senate and the House maybe saying, hold on, potentially?
I think at the end of the day, what happens with deportation is that you stop the problem first by getting much more serious about the border. And by 2019, the border, with the help of Mexico, was much more under control than it was after 2021. So you stop the problem that way. You probably make a very big public display of taking people who are just getting out of prison, have done things that were violent, and sending them back immediately. I think at the end of the day, you don't remove lots and lots of people. The family separation issues become too difficult. The sheer cost of doing it becomes too difficult. And you know, maybe 1 million people leave the country. I don't think 12 million people wind up leaving the country. And those million people
But Stephen Miller says it's going to be robust. It's going to be tens of millions.
Well, that's not a bad message to send to all the people thinking about coming in, frankly.
And I want to make this
Whether it
point.
happens or not, Steve.
Yeah, I want to make this point. Tariffs. Oh, that won't really happen because, you know, he's just using that as a bargaining chip, right? Deportations, that won't really happen. You know, so I think what's really fascinating in all this is some of the key components of the president's message in this last election most people don't think are going to happen. Now, is there political punishment for that? We'll see. But you know, we're going to cut waste and, you know, eliminate $2 trillion. Or at one point, Trump said that he's going to use cryptocurrency to pay off the debt. I mean, you know, does any of this happen? And so that's why I'm saying the important thing to do is to wait and see. And maybe it doesn't happen. Maybe he doesn't impose, you know, I think economy-threatening tariffs. Maybe he doesn't deport, you know, an essential workforce in this country. Maybe none of that happens. But he certainly has created public will and public sentiment for those things to happen.
If there's a question on this side, just raise your hand. We'll get to you. Senator Blunt, we are in the chamber that Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch, polar opposites, liberal Democrat, conservative Republican. Is there more bipartisanship that happens in the Senate than meets the eye? We follow the big stories, but does more happen that's under the radar that does not get the attention?
Well, there is, and part of that are the rules require that to happen. And part of it is the Senate is a place where relationships really do matter. There are only 100 of you. Generally, you got there through a series of political or other life steps that created your ability to work with people you didn't agree with. You know, as I said in my last speech on the Senate floor, to do something with somebody on the other side, you don't have to agree with them on everything. You just have to agree with them on one thing. And when you agree with them on one thing and you get something done, both of you and your staff begin to look, surely there's a second thing that we agree on. I know one year in the Senate there were 48 Democrats and 52 Republicans, and my staff checked to see how many of the Democrats I'd been the principal sponsor of a piece of legislation with. Not just a sponsor, but you know, most legislation that works has a Democrat and Republican as the first two names. And the answer was 44. 44 of 48. And my first question, well, what do we do with the other 4? Did we do anything with them? And there were actually a couple of things we had done with a couple of them, and a couple of them we'd never done anything with. But, you know, working together does matter. Getting things done does matter. And having people find satisfaction in, let me say this again, in the work instead of just the fight creates a different atmosphere. The Senate is a place where you do have relationships that matter and people that figure out how to work together, and the country benefits from that.
We have a question right over here. If we get the microphone over real quick. Senator Heitkamp, more gets done than meets the eye. Is there more bipartisanship?
Oh, absolutely. I think but no one likes to publicize it because you get criticized. Look at, he's working with that. Oh. And so I think that this doesn't, where it used to be with former senators in North Dakota, that was always the leading point. Look what I've done. Look what I've gotten done. None of that was done without Republicans, right? And look at how we've worked together. Look at how we've gotten things done. Now compromise and working with certain people has become like the bane of existence because of what social media will do to you. And so I think that more gets done than what you see with interesting characters. I always say probably my claim to fame is I had a bill that Sheldon Whitehouse, who is one of the top climate experts and you know, advocates for change, and Mitch McConnell were on the same bill. And
from Kentucky, Kentucky.
Coal, Kentucky, and because it was seen as maybe a pro-coal bill, but also a pro-climate bill. And so there's always these opportunities to find win-wins in legislation, but it requires you actually getting to get a vote. And how I got that done in the end was went hat in hand to my leader saying, please, 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 put this in reconciliation. It will fit. It will really help me. And no one sees the debate. No one sees the collaboration that goes into that effort because we don't believe in regular order anymore.
Yes, please, go ahead, thank you.
We're talking about all this immigration, the border, and what are the chances in reality of getting that wonderful bipartisan bill that was going to address all those issues but was killed by Trump? What are the chances of them getting, the groundwork's all laid, it would address a lot of the issues. What are the chances of getting it done in the next Congress?
Well, I wasn't there, so I don't know how. I don't think that bill was quite as wonderful as it's purported to be, but bills are never perfect. I've actually introduced a couple of perfect bills, but I've never voted. I've never voted for a perfect bill, and that might have been one of them. I think the problem for a long time on immigration has been trying to come up with a comprehensive solution. There are really 3 basic problems. How do you secure the border? What are the legitimate workforce needs of the country? And what do you do with people who came or stayed illegally? And the best people to decide how to secure the border, still sometimes I think of this like I was a House member, the best 218 House members to decide how to secure the border are not the best 218 House members to decide what are the legitimate workforce needs of the country. And neither of them are the best 218 people to decide what do we do about people who came or stayed illegally. The Dreamers, for instance, that should be a easy solution. But if you keep waiting for a comprehensive bill, one, I don't think you're going to get a very good bill. And so far, we have 20 years of a comprehensive bill producing nothing. At some point, when your plan doesn't produce anything, you need to come up with a different plan. And the problem with the plan is it involves some trust. Okay, if we solve this problem, are you going to be willing to solve the second problem? And the antidote to that certainly can't be, well, let's just decide not to solve any of the problems. But these are relatively solvable problems I think they're more solvable if we divide them up than they are if we try to keep them together.
I'm going to get to the final question, but you brought up the media a couple of times. I just want to buttonhole one issue because you talk about C-SPAN and cameras in the House and the Senate. We have social media. We have conservative media on Fox and One America News and liberal media on MSNBC, now podcasts, and this very disparate, fractured media environment. Has that, in your mind, hurt our democracy or helped?
I think exposure helps the democracy. We just need more discerning public. Honestly, I mean, you aren't gonna stop this. And so I look at what is the actual solution to this problem, and it's not limiting platforms, it's not cutting things off. It is actually creating a body politic that is critically thinking about the issues of the day. And when they take the shortcut, by that I mean whatever so-and-so says in the media, that's what I'm going to believe today. That is bad for the democracy. And so I think that's why institutions like this that promote civic education, that promote critical thinking, that bring in programs like this and the programs that the Institute brings in and the work that they do is so important because eventually it filters down. Ukraine was bombarded with propaganda from Russia, bombarded with falsehoods, misinformation. Guess what? It didn't really have an effect because they had a population that believed that you can't believe everything that you read, that you have to think about it, you have to go to other sources. And to me, that's the issue. It's not whether some talking head on Fox or talking head on MSNBC says something I don't agree with. The question is, why are people believing it carte blanche? And how do we get away from that?
Quick
and that's
follow-up?
a bigger problem.
Well, I think there's no question that a more generally watched media created a different kind of democracy. I do think that now you can find the media you want and get deeper and deeper into the corner you're inclined to get into anyway. And I don't think that's helpful. I think probably less helpful is, the average high school, college, young working adult gets their news off TikTok, 30 seconds at a time over and over again.
Even that long?
Yeah, and I think that's a problem. But it's made it really hard to become to have a political personality different than the personality of what people think your tribe is all about. And you did have a chance in an earlier media to do that. In 1979, more than half of the states in the country had a Democrat and a Republican in the Senate. 27 states in 79 had a Republican and a Democrat in the Senate. There's a 20-year period from 74 to 94 under that particular kind of media where that number was never less than 20. And right now it's 3 and it's 5, it's going to be 3. That's a different kind of voter, it's a different kind of exposure. I think you had a much greater chance. When I was elected Secretary of State in Missouri, I was the first Republican elected to that job in 52 years. And that was 40 years ago when you really had a chance to develop a sense of who you were in a generally watched media that was different than people who thought your tribe was. And I think we've lost that in the diversity of the media today and the tendency to get, again, deeper and deeper in the corner you're inclined to be in.
Yeah, one factoid. When I ran in 2012, 22%, I beat Mitt Romney, or I got 22% of Mitt Romney's votes. When I ran in 18, the margin where I could convert people on the other side to vote for me was only 5. Yeah. And so that's a phenomenon across the country. They're voting for a tribe and not for a person.
So final question, I've given time to think about it, Speaker Johnson, Leader Thune, President Trump, your advice to the incoming leadership on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue as a Republican?
Get the work done, get away from trying to govern through executive orders and regulations, and get the work done in the most public way you possibly can.
And to your Democratic leadership?
Pick your fights. Do not talk about everything that's going on. Think about what you want to say and how what you want to do is different than what they want to do, and be very, very clear, but quit the vitriol, quit exaggerating, catastrophizing everything that goes on in America, and get the work done.
Do you miss the Senate?
Love the Senate, don't miss the Senate.
I had a senator, when I was sworn in, a former senator from Idaho, come up to me and he said, you know, I'm going to tell you a story. When I first left the Senate, people would come up and say, do you miss the Senate? And I would say, oh, yeah, you know, I miss everybody. Now they say, aren't you glad you're not in the Senate? And that to me was absolutely a foretelling of the direction that we're going if we don't, as Americans, demand more of the people that we elect to go to Congress.
Well, we are glad you are here tonight at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the Study of the U.S. Senate. To Adam Hines and the great staff here, Emily Rupp, everybody who's been putting this together, thank you very much for joining us, and please come back again. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you all.
Adam?
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you for just an incredible conversation, a bipartisan conversation on what works and what doesn't work in the Senate, in politics, procedure, and policy. I want all of you who are here in person to join us for a reception now in the lobby. Thanks to all of you who are here, including our board chair, Bruce Pursley, and those of you joining us online. And give us another round of applause. Thanks again.
You gotta go.